Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. You guys know what time it is. Time to talk about current events in the online fitness community. And OmarIsuf, the shaman philosopher of YouTube fitness, has made a video saying you should stop doing these exercises. But really, he made it about something else. So let me go ahead and put on my I've had a speechcraft and let's talk about this. You know, Omar is one of these guys that he's really hit or miss these days. Some of the stuff he says is really good. Some of the stuff is mediocre. Some of it's bad. But he still says a lot of things that are good. And I think this is one of those videos to where he brought up, again, the excellent point. And again, he kind of put that clickbait title, right? You should stop doing these exercises. But the reality is, what he pointed out is that difficult isn't always effective. And that's what it comes down to. And people make that confusion because when it comes to this whole concept of exercising versus training, again, he cited Alan Thrall. Alan Thrall comes from the starting strength background. He was a starting strength coach and everything. What is it that the starting strength guys explain? And I think they do a great job of this. What's the difference between exercise and training? Exercise is something you do for a short-term effect, right? You exercise to either burn calories. You exercise to sweat. You exercise to get a sense of cathartic feeling like you achieved something. You do it for an acute response. It's something physical that you do for an acute response, meaning something in the short term, even if it's calorie burn, right? Because you're trying to lose weight. Training is something you do with a long-term planned outcome, meaning training is something that you approach sequentially with a game plan, knowing that if I do X and Y, that Z will be the outcome, right? And it's planned and understood. It's not random. It's actually a planned protocol to achieve a long-term result. So it's an acute versus a chronic response. And that's what he kind of talked about here, is that people will make the mistake because something is difficult that it gives you a training effect, right? And the reality is we're really balancing a lot of factors for training. We're balancing total training stimulus, total training fatigue. So again, things like mechanical tension, metabolic fatigue, all of that, and how they stack up in terms of the work you do with those versus things like recovery factors. I mean, there's a lot of exercises that some of the people he cited, like Scott Herman Fitness, promote that don't give a good training response. And the reason is, like an above-the-knee rack pull. The reason is because it gives, for the amount of perceived exertion from an exercise like that, and the amount of weight used, it's really, really difficult. You do it, it's like, man, I lift this big heavy weight. This is so hard, so taxing on my nervous system. And it has a recovery component that's actually worse than the deadlift, which is one of the hardest exercises to recover from. So something like that could be very difficult, but you're not going to really grow from it meaningfully compared to a lot of other choices. He didn't use that example. He used the stuff, though, of people taking awkward movements that are so awkward that you bleed energy instead of being able to put tension on the muscle. And they're like, wow, this is really hard. I must be getting a training effect, right? And he used the pistol squat as an example. Now, ironically, he's, of course, trained with Strap-On Destiny recently. And, of course, Strap-On had been doing the pistol squats and everything. And, of course, his leg development isn't proportionate to his upper body. That's very obvious even in his newest pictures, where he's got his fans kind of telling him, oh, your legs look great. But they're not. They don't. They're disproportionately small. But the point is that a pistol squat's the example Omar used, that you can get on there and it might seem really difficult because you're having to balance all this weight right on one leg. He's like, but if you think about the amount of loading and the tension that you can actually place on your quads and glutes and hip and everything else, is actually much lower than with a back squat for the same amount of perceived effort. And that's, again, the point he made, is that, and he's right, that you have to be able to load a muscle effectively. That if your goal is to, it doesn't matter whether your goal is to maximize strength, it doesn't matter whether your goal is to maximize hypertrophy, any of those goals, and we can argue about the degree of overlap being enormous between those, and it is, but any of those goals, you have to be able to effectively load a muscle. And if you're picking exercises that don't allow you to, again, effectively load the muscles and be able to progress on that loading, then you're not going to get particularly good results in terms of development. And we can even come over to that of why do we do accessory movements for strength athletes, right? As powerlifters, why do we do accessory movements? To put meat on us in the right places to make us stronger. Because if our triceps are a weak link in our bench press and we add meat to the right spot of the tricep, what happens to our bench press? It goes up, right? it goes up because we've addressed a weak link from a hypertrophy perspective, and a thicker muscle is capable of producing more contractile force. That's not a subject of debate in exercise science. You make a muscle grow, it has more force potential. So if your triceps are the weakest link in your bench press and you thicken up the heads of the tricep, like the medial head maybe down here, which might be your weakest link in your bench, you thicken it up, your bench press is probably going to go up. Right? It's going to improve. So we do this for these same purposes, and people need to keep that in mind. We are thickening up muscles to get stronger, but for people who are just trying to thicken the muscles up, you fall back under the same situation. If you're not being able to put direct tension on a muscle and to be able to load that muscle correctly with the exercise you're doing, it doesn't matter how sore you get, it doesn't matter how much pump you get, any of that stuff, because a pump itself doesn't induce muscle growth. Pump training by itself, particularly without the right drugs in place, may not give you any actual lasting hypertrophy without the presence of progression there. Because you can look at it all these different ways, but you can induce as much fatigue as you want on a muscle. Right? You can induce as much fatigue as you want, metabolic fatigue and pump and everything else, but without progressive tension over time and progressive workload, you're not going to get significant hypertrophy. You're going to get sometimes a short-term training effect that might allow it to pump a little easier, might let it hold a little more water, but when that inflammation goes down, it's gone. In fact, some of the studies that looked at some of this pump training that showed hypertrophy, like where they've done MRIs of the muscles and stuff, even ones that show growth, if they go 10 days without doing any of the pump work, they lose almost all the muscle growth that it achieved. It goes away in just over a week, completely, almost all of it. It's temporary. So you have to keep doing that pump work. So the point we come over to, he also talked about certain tricep extensions. And if you look at some of these little kickbacks and stuff that people are doing, and you compare those because of the way they're loaded, you can't really load it effectively, even though you might really feel it and you feel like it's difficult and awkward, you have to brace yourself in this position. You might feel that that's the case, but you can't load as much tension on that muscle as you can with something like a simple skull crusher. And if you can't load as much tension on the muscle, even though it might feel more difficult to set up, the lack of being able to create mechanical tension on it, you're stuck to deal with purely metabolic work. You're just like, how much of a pump can I get here instead of how much actual loading can I put on the muscle? And that's the problem with volume. When you rely purely upon volume to grow a muscle, it's not going to give you the same longer term results. It's not going to give you that because volume is a driver of hypertrophy up to a threshold, right? When you increase volume, hypertrophy goes up dramatically up to a certain point. And then after that, it stops and starts regressing. So volume itself isn't even the pure driver of hypertrophy. Mechanical tension is always a factor. And mechanical tension requires loading. And when I say that tension, I don't mean just a 1 rep max. I'm talking about how much weight you can do through a full range of motion on lift for 5 reps, for 10 reps, all that. That's still tension. In other words, 30 extra pounds of weight put on a muscle through a 10 rep range is still 30 pounds more tension through a 10 rep range. It matters. It absolutely matters. And again, we don't mean just the weight move. We mean how much of that weight is transferring to the muscle that you want to develop. And I'm glad that he brought that up because that's the thing. Omar is coming back around to that. And he's not mentioning the fact that I discussed this already. But his arm training failed. All his bro arm experiment that he was doing and Strap-on was doing and other people were doing, it failed. Why? Because they were doing a lot of fluff and just relying on pure volume and hoping that metabolic fatigue and bodybuilding type pump work would bring up their arms. And the reality is, without the right combination of drugs, it doesn't really produce any significant results over time. It just doesn't. The guys you see who get really jacked off of pure pump work, that's drugs doing it. It's not the training by itself that's going to achieve that, because it won't if you're drug free or you're a casual user of the wrong drug. It's not going to give you the desired result. It might give you some short term, hey, the muscle gets fuller longer, it holds a little more glucose, but that's going to fade. You have to have that tension there. You have to pick exercises that you can load. And so basically what he's saying, the exercises you need to stop doing are exercises that are difficult, that you can't effectively load the target muscles with, and that you can't progress on effectively as far as progressive overload. If you do a little awkward exercise that maybe you can put a little tension on the muscle for a little while, but you can't progress on it over time, you're not going to get gains out of that exercise, no matter how difficult you think that exercise is. And that's just a simple reality. All All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.